So, have you ever stopped to think about how an entire art form changes? It's a huge question, right? Today, we're going to dive into a really fascinating moment in literary history, a time when all the old rules were starting to crumble and a whole new way of feeling and writing was being born. I mean, how does something like that actually happen? How does an entire artistic movement, with all its traditions and what everyone thinks is correct, just give way to something brand new? Does it happen all at once in some big, sudden revolution? Well, the truth is, change is almost never a sudden lightning strike. It's more like a slow dawn. It happens in these quiet moments of experimentation. One poem, one new idea, one single line at a time. So, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to walk across that very bridge. First, we'll get a feel for the two worlds of poetry that were clashing. Then, we'll see exactly how the bridge between them got built. We'll meet two of the main architects, Thomas Gray and Robert Burns. And by the end, you'll see why this shift from one era to another is so important, even today. All right, to really get this, you first have to understand the two sides of the canyon. The late 18th century was this massive literary crossroads, and it was caught between two really powerful, totally opposing forces. The super strict, orderly world of Neoclassicism and the passionate, free-spirited world of Romanticism that was just starting to bubble up. And this really lays out the basic conflict. On one side, you've got the neoclassical age. Think logic, rules, order. Poetry was a craft that you perfected. Society mattered more than the individual. But on the other side, you have the emerging romantic age. This was all about freedom, raw emotion, imagination, and the inner world of one person. This wasn't just a simple change in style. It was a total revolution in how people thought about being human. So how do you get from one to the other? You don't just jump across a chasm like that. You need a bridge. And that bridge, that in-between period, is what we call transitional poetry. It's not quite one thing, not quite the other, but this really cool, fascinating blend of both. And what's really important here is that transitional poetry isn't some kind of lesser, half-formed art. No way. It's a super dynamic period of transformation. You have these writers who are using the tools of the past to build the language of the future. They're caught in this beautiful, creative tension between reason and emotion, tradition and pure innovation. And this all happened through four really key shifts. First, poetry started moving away from these big, universal, rational truths and started digging into deep, personal feelings. Second, it left the polished, artificial world of high society and started finding beauty in simple, natural settings. Third, it stopped focusing only on kings and nobles and started telling the stories of ordinary people. And finally, that formal, objective voice of the poet started to fade, making way for something much more personal and direct. Let's see how this worked in practice. Okay, our first bridge builder is Thomas Gray. You can kind of think of him as the architect of this whole transition. He was a scholar, he deeply respected the old rules, but his own work was just filled with this new kind of emotional depth that was totally different. Just listen to this famous line from his masterpiece, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. It captures his spirit perfectly. On one hand, it's a profound, universal moral thought, very neoclassical. But on the other, it's soaked in this somber, personal melancholy that feels intensely romantic. It's a big philosophical idea, but it's wrapped in a deeply human feeling. And you can see this perfect blend all through his work. See, on the neoclassical side, the poem gives you a moral lesson, and it's written in this perfectly balanced, structured form. But then, on the romantic side, it's overflowing with personal emotion. It's set in a quiet, rural landscape. And this is huge. It's all about the uncelebrated lives of poor villagers. Gray basically proved you could use the old structures to express brand new feelings. So if Gray was the architect, then our next guy, Robert Burns, was the voice of the bridge. Born to a poor farming family in Scotland, Burns didn't just write about the common man, he was the common man. His poetry was raw, it was authentic, and honestly, it was pretty revolutionary. And you've got to understand the world he was living in. Scotland was wrestling with its identity. The air was buzzing with new ideas about reason and humanity from the Enlightenment. And, oh yeah, the ideals of liberty and equality were literally exploding in America and then France. This wasn't just a backdrop for him. It was the engine that gave his poetry its urgency and its power. This iconic line, you've probably heard it before. It comes from a poem he wrote right after he accidentally destroyed a mouse's nest while he was plowing a field. And in that tiny, everyday tragedy, Burns saw this giant, universal truth.
He realized that the struggles of a little mouse weren't all that different from the struggles of a poor farmer like him. Life is fragile, and our plans often fall apart whether we're men or mice.
The literary tool he uses to pull this off has a fancy name: anthropomorphism. He basically gives the mouse human feelings, like fear and panic. He even talks to it as a fellow mortal. And by doing that, he just erases the distance between us and nature. He's suggesting that we're all in this together. This was a radical idea, and a huge leap towards the full-blown romantic celebration of nature. Okay, so why does this in-between period, this bridge, matter so much? I mean, it's just a phase, right? Well, no, because without it, the history of literature would look completely different. These poets weren't just fiddling with style, they were fundamentally changing what poetry could even do. When you get right down to it, what Gray and Burns and others like them did was profound. They held on to the discipline and craft of the past, but they used it to pry open a door to the emotional and imaginative freedom of the future. So their legacy is pretty huge. You can break it down into four main things. One, they carried forward the structure and clarity of Neoclassicism, so it wasn't just thrown away. Two, they unlocked the gates for the whole Romantic movement to come pouring through. Three, they showed us that big changes in art happen through evolution, not just sudden revolution. And maybe most important of all, they taught the world that the lives, the joys, the sorrows of everyday people were worthy of the highest art. And that kind of leaves us with one last thought. This process of building bridges between eras, it never really stops. Every generation has its transitional artists, so it makes you wonder, right? What art forms today are living in that in-between space, blending the old with the new, and quietly building a bridge to a future that we can't even see yet?